For the next 6 weeks, we're going to be together exploring the subject of the history of religion in America. I think that this is a particularly timely topic. I know that many of you took Dr. Harrelson's class in the fall, and so I would like to think that this would in some way follow up on his class. So by all means, I want you to feel free to share with us, the class, or with me individually, anything that you especially want to hear about, anything that you are particularly curious about. I may not know the answer, but perhaps I will know someone who does. So I encourage you to bring your ideas about religious history and the United States history as well here to this class while we are together for these weeks. In about 1999, the Dalai Lama was asked to speak at the Field Museum in Chicago. And he visits Chicago actually quite regularly. As I understand it, he has friends who live in the area, and he often goes to Chicago when he comes to the United States. And he told the people who were planning this program that what he wanted them to do was to get some folks from the community. Now, folks, I don't mean folks exactly like you and I, but he wanted them to get a few noted Chicagoans or people from that environment of Chicago to ask him questions. He thought it would be much more interesting for people to ask him questions than for him to just get up and give a lecture. And so one of the three people that was invited to do this was Garry Wills. Garry Wills is a well-known journalist. He has taught for a number of years at Northwestern. He has written a stack of books that's probably taller than I am about various subjects related to politics, related to history, and related to religion. And so Garry Wills was invited to participate in this panel. Now, to have a kind of a dry run, they met privately, the three panelists met with the Dalai Lama to discuss what the plan of action would be. And the Dalai Lama told these folks to by all means ask really difficult questions. He didn't want them to be so awed by him that they asked these lame questions. How do you like Chicago, or something of that nature? How's the weather? And so Garry Wills was really sort of stumped by this because he really didn't know exactly what he should ask that would be not insulting to the Dalai Lama, but would be an important question that his audience would like to ask. So what he came up with was, if you were restored to authority in your country, Tibet, what would you do in a different way? And the Dalai Lama had a very quick response. His response was that he would disestablish religion. And that was rather provocative coming from a religious leader. He went on to talk about the fact that he felt one of the many, many great things about the United States was the fact that we did have religious pluralism. We did not have a state church, a great religion, an authority of a religion, and he felt that we really benefited by this great diversity and this great pluralism here in this country. Now, many people probably in this room disagree with me or disagree with the Dalai Lama about that. You may see this as a fairly homogeneous country, but we were founded on diversity, and great many people came for many, many different reasons to this country. Your forebears, whether they came a generation ago, whether you came a few years ago, or whether you've been in this country since Jamestown was founded, or since the Native Americans walked the land, we have a great deal of diversity here among people, and they didn't all come for religious reasons. In fact, very few of them came for religious reasons. They came because they wanted to better themselves. So that's what I want to talk about today, is the people who came here, why they came, and then what happened to them. How did they change the place they arrived in, this continent of North America? And how did the people who were here just a little bit longer than they had been, than we still are, how did those people change the religion as it was known in Europe when the Europeans arrived over here? So, of course, we have to start with the Catholics in Columbus. We know that there were these native tribes here on the continent of North and South America. They were flourishing quite well. Some of you may have been up to Cahokia, Illinois. It's just across the river from St. Louis, a beautiful place, a historic site of the Mississippian culture. We know that Mississippian culture began to die out sometime about 100 years or so before Columbus arrived. We're not quite sure why. We have several theories about it, and if you go up there, you can tour the site, and they will indeed point out several of the theories as to why the Mississippian culture faded away. Maybe they overused the land. Maybe they had some sort of intertribal crisis. Perhaps it was disease. But we do know that the Spanish laid claim to North and South America after Columbus came over here, even though Columbus himself really, I don't think, ever really believed he had found a new place. He still thought he was off the coast of China. And so what this did for Spain in the short order was to make Spain a very, very wealthy country. Spain was able to take the gold, the silver, the precious metals that they found, and they were able to really become the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the world, at least in Western Europe, in that part of the world. And so the Spanish came in, always a highly religious group of people. Columbus himself was a very religious Roman Catholic. And Catholicism was the only Christian religion that was really known. Now, I do know there's some here in Nashville who might disagree with me about that. There's always an exception to just about everything. But let us, for the sake of this discussion, assume that most everybody accepted the tenets of the Catholic Church if they were a Christian. Now, Columbus came from Spain, and I think that is actually fairly significant. Why Spain? Why not another country? He was from Genoa. Why did he come from Spain? Well, the Spanish monarchs had been very successful in uniting these kingdoms under themselves, Ferdinand and Isabella. And in the process of all of that, they decided that the diversity that had made Spain thrive, this culture where you had Christians, you had Jews, you had the Moors, they decided in the process that that was not really such a good idea. They needed to push out the Moors, they needed to push out the Jews, and make Catholicism the central and only religion that was accepted there. So here comes Columbus and those who followed as devout Catholics. And so, of course, they see here on this continent these people that they identify as heathens. They were heathens because they were different. Now, you know, you always hear that Columbus said, or that the native peoples that he encountered thought they were gods. Well, why do we tell that to our children, that Indians thought the Spanish were gods? Well, the reason we tell that to our children is because Columbus wrote it down. Did Columbus really know what they thought of him? I doubt it. I'm sure he didn't know what they thought of him, but because this got written down, it became the official story when it was a far stretch from the reality. The native people here certainly were a religious people, but religion was all around them. And the thing that perhaps differentiated between them and Catholic Europe was that they did not believe in damnation. They did not believe in this notion of the total depravity of mankind, and they did not believe that there was a hell for those who were eternally damned. Now, we could spend courses and courses on the native religions, and that will have to be saved for another course here for Osher to explore the native religions of the native people. Carl Jung wrote a little bit about that from time to time. I know several of you have read Carl Jung quite a bit. But the native peoples were initially incredibly threatened by the religion that the Spanish brought. They just thought Catholicism was another thing to be added into their religious repertoire. So here come the Spanish with their monks, the Franciscans, a little bit later the Dominicans, and the native peoples tried to incorporate this. You see this especially if you go out to Santa Fe and tour some of those early sites there, particularly those missions. You see that the native people, the Pueblos in New Mexico, said, well, sure, let's add baby Jesus here. That's cute. Let's put this in. And they got into a little bit of trouble with the Spanish after the Spanish got established out there in New Mexico, because the monks decided that any hint of this pagan religion that they saw had to finally be wiped out. And so with great ceremony, the monks go to the conquistadores, the soldiers who are accompanying the monks. The monks go to these soldiers and say, you've got to crack down on these folks. And so that's pretty much, in a short version, what happened. The authorities round up several who are not really towing the line as they are supposed to be. And when the authorities do that, they have a fairly formal trial. 3 of these Pueblo people are hanged. One of them, who becomes a leader, Pope, is actually publicly flogged. And so this happens now. I'll give you a little chronology. This happens about 1675, so we'll take a step back here in just a minute, but I want to get the Spanish covered here in the beginning. So Pope says, these people don't want to cooperate with us, they want to control us. And so over the next few years, he organizes a revolt against the Spanish in what is now New Mexico. 2,000 of the Pueblo people attack the Spanish. More than half of the monks who were there were killed. All of the Spanish fled back into the safety of Mexico, and that was sort of the end of that. So I think the church learned a lesson, or should have anyway, from what happened here in New Mexico. The church is going to have to adapt to the place they are trying to influence, as opposed to coming in and telling people exactly what to do and exactly how they had to do everything associated with their lives. So now, the French come over pretty quickly after the Spanish. Everybody wants this great wealth that the Spanish have. The French will come just like the Spanish from France, except over to the northern part of North America, and they will not find the precious jewels, the minerals that the Spanish found to make them wealthy, but at least for the short time, they find something that does make them pretty well off, pretty wealthy, pretty prosperous. And they, just like the Spanish, they bring in the friars. There's some of you have read several of those books about the Jesuits, the black robes, and the exploration that the Jesuits in the black robes did on North America, particularly the northern part of North America. So the French come in, they find a lucrative market in the fur trade, and this makes them very, very wealthy. Not as wealthy as Spain, perhaps, but they're doing pretty well. Well, meanwhile, England is kind of the last group to get into the picture here. Now, at this point, before we get the English here, I think I need to, let's see if I can do this in 2 minutes. Probably not possible, but I'll try it. The English have their own political problems at home. And theirs are really kind of what you might say are the tail end almost of a religious crisis that the Catholic Church is having on the continent of Europe. All of you know the story of Martin Luther. He is a practicing Catholic priest. He is very faithful to the church, and he becomes quite concerned that so much money is being raised for cathedrals, and in particular, bigger and bigger cathedrals. Now, Martin Luther, you must understand, he would have never gotten anywhere if he hadn't had people of influence who said, you know, we shouldn't be sending all that money to Rome. We should keep it right here in Germany. He would have never, ever gotten anywhere without political backing. But after he watches over and over again many, many very poor Catholics paying indulgences, a payment of money of some kind to get out of purgatory, he becomes convinced that this and a whole lot of other practices of the Catholic Church are wrong. How can you watch people starving on the streets and be building this massive cathedral? He asks himself. And so in an act of criticism of the church, he posts a list of his criticisms of the church on the door of the church in Wittenberg. If you've been to Germany, Wittenberg is sort of outside of Berlin. Lots of things have been restored there related to Martin Luther. These are what he calls his, or what become known as, I should say, his 95 Theses. And this, we always simplify things by saying this is the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Well, in a way it kind of is, but you know, you've got all these ideas fermenting. This wouldn't have happened without some other people who had been thinking of this for a long time before Martin Luther actually put it on a piece of paper. Martin Luther wanted to clean up the Catholic Church, to purify the Catholic Church, and reform the Catholic Church. Of course, you understand that the Pope and other Catholic officials did not like his ideas. They saw him as a heretic, and he was thrown out of the church. So thus begins the Protestant Reformation. And Martin Luther has a great number of people who like to hear what he has to say. This notion of purifying the church spreads all the way over to France. And so soon you've got French who are protesting the Catholic Church. Now, as a result of this, the Catholic Church in France starts trying to get rid of anybody who differs with their ideas and beliefs and control. And so many French are forced out, one of which happens to be a young lawyer by the name of John Calvin. John Calvin goes from France to Switzerland. He will end up in Geneva. John Calvin will really provide the Reformation, or the idea of changing religion and the structure. He will provide the Reformation and order. He brings order to it. And the way that he does this is by writing another great big stack of books called his Institutes, and he will publish a very strict format, religious structure for how he thinks the church should be. Now, Luther and Calvin never met, although they were really not that very many miles apart. They differed on one key subject, and that is the idea, the belief of when the communion is taken, the bread that is taken by the people taking communion, that is served by the official of the church. Lutherans believed, Martin Luther believed, that that was transformed into the body of Christ. Calvin said, no, it is the Spirit of Christ. And so they differed on the subject of communion. That was the big difference. It really wasn't so much on organization. But one of the things that Calvin talked about, and oh, by the way, over at the Divinity School, there is a very fine scholar on John Calvin whom I've heard speak, and you really should ask him to come to Osher sometime. He would be a great speaker for your group. Nonetheless, Calvin provides a representative structure. In other words, now this is pretty important over here, I think. Calvin believes that you start with a local congregation, and a certain group of those people are elected as the leaders. We might call those people elders or deacons. So then these people are representative of all of the congregants, and they form themselves from other congregations into these clusters called presbyteries. And there's this great structure for Calvin's idea of the church, how it should be, and at the top is the head body of the church, not the College of Cardinals, but the General Assembly. Now, what do we call that legislative body that is meeting downtown right now? The Tennessee General Assembly. Maybe there's some connection. I don't know. All right, now, Calvin was a person who was very sure of his ideas. Now, he believed in the total depravity of man. I don't think that's too different from the Catholic Church, but he differed from the Catholic Church in that he did not believe you could do anything about being chosen by God. Either you were chosen or you weren't. Now, this is what all of you understand as predestination. Others might neutralize that or tone it down a little bit and call it grace. But what Calvin believed and wrote pages and pages on was that God elects certain people. And you don't know whether you're elected or not, but we are going to know that you are not elected if you act very badly. So it is incumbent upon you to behave yourself. Atonement, being saved from your sins, if you want to look at it that way, atonement is really conditional. There's nothing you can do about it. Either God gave it to you or God did not give it to you. There's nothing you can do about it, which to some of you, you will find that very, very comforting. To my students, they would not find anything that they were not going to be rewarded for comforting at all. They don't want to learn material just because it's beautiful and fascinating. What they want to know is the one basic question. Will this be on the test? Exactly. So nothing else matters. That's all my students really want to know. The beauty of the story of American history is not uppermost in their minds. So, alas, we have Calvin's ideas really spreading. But of course, you know, this is just how the world is. Somebody is soon going to differ with Calvin. Well, we kind of like this business about the total depravity of man. Point number one, Calvin's got 5 points. See me after class if you really want to know the other 4. Point one, we agree with you on the depravity of man, but 2, 3, 4, and 5, all this business about election and saved by grace, we're not so sure about that. We need to be able to do something to get some points up there on the heavenly wall chart. So, a whole group of people will break off from Calvin. And, you know, there's splintering going on all over the place during this period of time. And these folks will have some influence on a group of folks in England that are going to try to purify the English church, and we're going to call these folks the Puritans. Now, back to England. All right. Henry VIII, you know this story quite well. How many of you have, especially I know some of you women just devour fiction, how many of you have read the hot book right now, Wolf Hall? Sally, have you? Lots of people are reading it. It's all about Henry VIII's break with the church. It's a novel. It won the Booker Prize or something recently, but it's a great big fat novel. I'm nearly to the exciting conclusion. But it's about Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII breaking with the Catholic Church. Now, this is a well-documented story. Henry VIII wanted a different wife. He realized that he was going to have to do some theological tap dancing to say that he hadn't been married to Catherine, who he really was married to. So, you know, anytime you have a position and you don't really have anything exactly to back it up, you can find some theologian who is going to agree with you. And so that's pretty much what Henry VIII did. He finds some people who come in and they read the laws of Moses and they say, oh, you weren't supposed to have married your dead brother's wife. Oh, that marriage is absolutely false. You really weren't married to Catherine. End of story. You can marry Anne Boleyn. So then, of course, there's another one and another one and another one after Anne. But nonetheless, this is a very different Reformation from the Reformation on the continent of Europe. Henry VIII really wasn't exactly interested in reforming the church. He was pretty happy with the structure. He was pretty happy with the ornate cathedrals, his Archbishop at York, his Archbishop at Canterbury. He was pretty happy with the structure, but he just didn't want all this English gold going to Rome. He decided that, you know, he could keep it at home. So in order to get support for his marital dilemma, he is able to entice other wealthy Englishmen to support this, because what happens when the church is banished and the Church of England is created is that the property, of which there was tremendous properties of the church in England, is turned over to Henry, but rather than just keeping it for himself, he sells it to wealthy elite nobility, and so these nobles have a big vested interest in not seeing a return of the Catholic Church a la Mary, and so they will support Elizabeth, and Elizabeth will keep England Protestant. And a few chances along the way for England to go back to Catholicism never worked because, and I think a large part of it is because Henry was very smart in selling the church's land to wealthy people who would support him politically. Now, some people say, if you want to split hairs here, some people say that Henry was not a heretic. He did not differ really on the subject of doctrine of the church. He was a schismatic In other words, he wanted to break with the church, but he wasn't a heretic. You can see if you can split those hairs. It doesn't really much matter to me whether he was a heretic or a schismatic, but to others that might be more interesting to think about and to decide. So the Church of England comes in, which is just really a replacement of the authority. And the king is the head of the Church of England. The structure is very much that episcopal structure of governance where you have bishops and archbishops and so on and so forth. So England is not able to really take advantage of all of this wealth that the Spanish and to a lesser extent the French are amassing. But that will all change when Elizabeth's little armada of ships is able to defeat the great big fleet of the Spanish who have come to dethrone her in 1588. Now, the English had valiantly tried to come over here. They had issued some patents, some contracts, some charters, if you will. Those sea dogs had come over here, Sir Edmund Gilbert and others, but they hadn't really been able to really get a colony going. Of course, in the north you've got the French, in the south you've got the Spanish, so all that is left is right here in the middle. And so here come, after Elizabeth's defeat of the Spanish Armada, a good number of English will begin to come. Now, all of you, I'm sure, know the story of the lost colony of Roanoke that had been started in 1587. Then the Armada crisis took place, and when they came back a couple of years after the defeat of the Armada, we don't know what happened to them. There were none of those people left. So 1607 is kind of one of those big years in American history because this is when the colony of Jamestown is founded. The colony of Jamestown is a joint stock company. It's a company that's been started for the purpose of making a profit. Isn't that why you usually invest in stock? To make a profit. And so here come some Anglican businessmen over here. Now, if you read some historians, they will make a very big point of the fact that these people were the second and third and fourth sons of nobility. In other words, these sons, the people who initially come to Jamestown, are not going to be the ones who are going to build the great big manor house up there. Instead, they are going to be the ones who are the second and third and fourth sons that aren't going to inherit the big manor house in England, so they're going to come here and outdo Big Brother by building themselves one here. If you really want to read a good book about that, read David Hackett Fisher. He has a great deal to say about the people who came here into different parts. But what we know is that Jamestown was almost a total failure. The people were not prepared to farm. The Indians certainly were not threatened in any way by the people who came. These English who looked so scraggly, I mean, they were dirty. They didn't take a bath. They had hair on their face. I mean, there was no threat. And they very nearly all died out from starvation, mainly because they didn't even know they shouldn't drink that dirty water, that brackish water where they had located their community, their fortress, Jamestown. All right, Jamestown will ultimately finally get off the ground when they get some order and find a cash crop. No, they don't find any wealth in precious minerals, but they do finally perfect a mild strain of a weed known as tobacco, and the rest of that story, you know how that goes. And so in order to fully take advantage of all the potential wealth from raising tobacco, they will eventually, not in the beginning, but eventually bring in slaves. Initially, when they did start the tobacco production in a larger scale, the most financially expedient way of getting labor was to bring in indentured servants. Slaves were expensive, and you bring in an indentured servant, all you're paying is really their passage, a whole lot less than a slave, and then if they die, so what? If your slave dies and you've invested, now that's all going to come to, there's going to be a crisis over bringing in these indentured servants eventually, and then they will make a turn and go to slavery. Now, let us go up to New England, because I'm sure there are people in this room, Dr. McSeveny, who might be from New England, so I want to be fair about the people from New England. Another group or two or three or four or five decide they want to come over here to establish English colonies or to be a part of the Virginia colony. So we have two different groups of people coming. In 1620, a group of people who call themselves Pilgrims, but who really were, they saw themselves as on a pilgrimage. They were people who wanted to completely separate from the Church of England. They saw the Church of England as fairly hopeless. They had gone over to Holland for a while. Then they realized their children were learning to speak Dutch and wanting to marry the Dutch, and so they decided to come over here, and they got a patent, a contract to come over here, supposedly to settle in the northern part of the Virginia colony, but they landed a little bit further north. Now, if you want to know all about the Pilgrims, read Nathaniel Philbrick's book. I'm sure some of you have already read this book, The Mayflower. It's a very, very popular book. It's everywhere. And it's really focuses on a lot of things that happen in New England. The Pilgrims come, you know the story. The Pilgrims, not themselves, but their descendants, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they get it to this point in life, it might be around 50 or 60 years old, that they kind of need to claim their heritage, their ancestry. You know, the genealogy bug doesn't generally bite 20-year-olds. It generally bites people who are 60 and really suddenly interested in where they came from, and so on and so forth. So the descendants of these folks really managed to craft their story of American history, the founding of these 13 colonies that became the United States, and giving their ancestors a starring role. So the Pilgrims come in 1620. They're a small group. They have some crises with the Indians. They are very religious. You know that they have a little agreement, a covenant among themselves. That's a good religious term. It is sort of has a divine aspect to it, and they will come in, but they will be very small in population, and they will always be struggling. 10 years later, 1630, in come the Puritans, and the floodgates are suddenly opened wide. Now, the Puritans were not much different from the Pilgrims back there in England. They wanted to clean up the Church of England, the Anglican Church. They said, well, we did away with the Pope. We have a new religion, the Church of England, but it looks just exactly like the Catholic Church. You know, the archbishops live in great big houses. They eat a lot of wonderful food. They have people doing everything they need to be done. They have built these magnificent cathedrals. Nothing has changed. We want to purify the church. So the Puritans come in beginning in 1630, and there are boatloads after boatloads coming after that point. Primarily because in England, the Puritans have suddenly become so numerous as to be a political threat. And so lots of Puritans will come. And they came because they saw an opportunity They saw an opportunity to make money, and they wouldn't have to be subservient to the Church of England. And I think this is where we in the United States often kind of miss a big point of what they were leaving when we focus so much on the Church of England and what we call freedom of religion over here. We forget that what these people really wanted to get away from was that English in stone class structure. I mean, you were a peasant if you were born a peasant, and you're a peasant, and you're a peasant, and you're a peasant. And your grandchildren and great-grandchildren and on down the line are going to be peasants. And then you have nobility, and you're born, you're elect. Hey, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? You're one of the chosen. You're up there at the top. So getting away from that class system of the haves and the have-nots, that was really put into law in England, was a very important thing for the Puritans who came over here. Did they come for religious reasons? They came for some religious reasons, but they did not come to allow freedom of religion. They came over here led by a former lawyer who becomes their governor, John Winthrop. They come over here, and they're going to create this almost like a utopian society. They're going to have a commonwealth. And John Winthrop, you can go online through the miracle of the computer now, and you can read all manner of John Winthrop's writing. He was very prolific. He kept a journal, and I think he kept it partly out of his ego, because I really think he kept the journal because he wanted to show the generations that followed how a proper Christian community would work. Now, his ideas, his theology was certainly a lot of John Calvin's, total depravity of man. But a part of this was, if we as a group of God's people are good, God is going to bless us. Now, of course, you're going to have to look at the other side of this. If one of us is bad, maybe the rest of us are still doing very well. If one of us is bad, God's going to punish all of us for this person who is acting bad. So what James Winthrop does is come in, and the only way you can survive is by complete conformity. And the way you can judge whether you're doing well or not is if there's some kind of crisis, then you know God is out to punish you. So punishment by God becomes the explanation for everything that might happen to go wrong. If you're sick, God clearly is punishing you or testing you. And this was a complete contradiction of what they said they were leaving. Why were they leaving England? Why were they leaving the Catholic Church back before that? Because the Catholic Church and now the Church of England required complete conformity. So what do they do when they get over here? They demand complete conformity. This is the only way we're going to have order. And so individualism is not really approved of by the Puritans. Now the Puritans, their population takes off. Unlike the folks down in Jamestown, they brought families. They brought women. They brought children. They were fruitful and multiplied. And after an initial crisis or two, the population grows and grows and grows. Now, of course, you know, anytime anything gets bigger beyond just a small group of people, what you're going to see happening is somebody's going to say, you know, Governor Winthrop, I don't like one of your ideas here. And one of the first people who really kind of gets his name, at least in the history books, who challenges Governor Winthrop is Roger Williams. Roger Williams is a Puritan preacher. He has come, he's preached in Salem, he's preached in Plymouth, he's been in those little communities there preaching, but he differs with Governor Winthrop on two specific points. First of all, everything is tightly woven together, religion and the civil governance of each community. You all have heard of the New England town meetings. You've heard, you know all about this. So everything is all woven together. And you have a group of people who are able to make the decisions. They become the magistrates. These are the visible saints. And these visible saints are the only ones who can vote, who can participate in the town meetings and elect the magistrates. Now, ladies, forget it. You are not going to be really considered of anything here. That will come loud and true here in a minute. And so consequently, the Puritans have this strict governance, and Roger Williams thinks about it, and he says, you know, how do you really know that he is a visible saint? What if he's just putting on because he was elect? Remember, nobody can tell. He may be predestined, but we don't know for sure. Roger Williams even talked about the fact that he prayed every night, every day with his wife, and he wasn't even sure that she was a saint. So he questions this, and of course this idea, this is really threatening to our community. The other idea that he had that went cross with John Winthrop was about the land. Roger Williams felt that the land belonged to the people who possessed it in the beginning, which were the native people. The Pequots, the Narragansetts, these Indian tribes. Now, to be fair to the Puritans did make some effort to buy much of the land. But how much is still the big question here. So the Puritans cannot tolerate these views being spoken. Now, a word about Puritan discipline, because, you know, they were very strict and had a great deal of discipline, but they did sort of fall short of capital punishment on most offenses. The things that you're familiar with are the stocks, the dunking chair, some sort of public branding of people for their sins, but they really were very cautious about exerting condemning somebody to be killed. I think part of that was really because in England a peasant could be shot for stealing a wealthy person's rabbit, you know, hunting and snaring a wealthy person's rabbit. You could be hung for that, so consequently hanged for that. I think they were very cautious about giving capital punishment to anybody, and so what they did was say the only crimes that will be condemned for capital punishment will be those that are condemned in the Bible. And because I can't remember these, I wrote a list down for you. Blasphemy, of course, every one of these is subject to interpretation. Witchcraft, reason, murder, rape, adultery, incest, sodomy, which is really homosexuality, and buggery, which is really bestiality. So those were the only things that were capital punishment. Okay, what are you going to do with Roger Williams? He is a threat. He is trouble. Why don't you send him back to England? That's what we'll do. So they decide to send Roger Williams back to England. Well, Roger Williams says, no thank you, and he escapes. He leaves and goes just down the road to Providence Bay. There is a beautiful bay there. He goes down there and forms his own place. For a while he lives with the Indians. He trades with the Indians. He sets up a trading post. And as you can imagine, as other people get cross with with the Winthrop and the Puritans, they will find their way down to Providence, and the population surrounding Roger Williams' farm will grow, and will grow very rapidly. Now, if you haven't been to Providence or Newport, you really should go sometime. They're very interesting cities, and one of the things that Providence is the most proud of is Roger Williams Church, which is the first Baptist church of Providence. Now, Baptists have lots of different ideas about who was the first of anything, and so dare I not to get into that discussion today, but they do have this very lovely historic church there, which they say was the first Baptist church. The Baptists were a group of these people who didn't like John Calvin's ideas. They broke off from him, and you can really see here in this country, much more so than in Europe, that people take their theology and they sort of mold it here in this country to fit the circumstances. And so the Baptists didn't like the hierarchy of the church, and they are among the many, many who are congregational in the structure of their church governance. So Roger Williams realizes that people want to come to this place. He wants to protect it from the Puritans and from any legal challenge. So after he's got this community, Providence, established, Roger Williams, does make a trip back to England, where he will meet with the officials of the crown and will get a proper charter for this colony of Rhode Island. So lots of people want to come here because he believes in complete separation of church and state. The religious leaders, there should be no religious test, the complete separation, which was what he had differed with Winthrop in the beginning about. So you can imagine how this flourishes. And you can also understand why, as Rhode Island really gets going, that some of these Sephardic Jews who have been pushed out of Spain will say, North America looks pretty good. Let's go over there, but we sure don't want to go down there to Jamestown. We sure don't want to go up there to Boston with all those Puritans, so let's go to Rhode Island. And so you will see a good number of Jews coming in to Rhode Island before 1700. They won't get a synagogue built until 17-something. A little bit later, the survival is a kind of a big issue for everybody concerned, but there is a synagogue still in existence in Newport, the Touro Synagogue, which is a very lovely synagogue, and it's on the National Registry, and you can tour that as well after you finish, or maybe before you go visit the Vanderbilts and all those other big houses at Newport. So, the folks in Boston, the Puritans, were they upset about Roger Williams? Nah, we can just send everybody that doesn't conform down there to Rhode Island, because after all, if we try them and they have not conformed and we have to send them back to England, they might go into the English court system and get our authority challenged. So let's just send them down to Rhode Island, to Providence, and they won't be any trouble to us, and we'll be rid of them. So Rhode Island became known as the sewer of the colonies. And, sewer kind of denotes a kind of something that wasn't very nice, and those Puritans didn't much like sewers. We don't want to talk about sewers. We don't want to talk about our sewer line leaking, but we do understand, like the Puritans, that a sewer is sometimes necessary and does have its own benefits. So, great diversity right there in Rhode Island. And if you go up there, you can barely find where Massachusetts stops and Rhode Island begins. Providence and Boston are, 40, 50 miles from each other, but not very far at all. So you won't have any trouble getting around up in New England. Well, there are lots of people that disagree, and they start leaving. One of them that I think is quite noteworthy, mainly because she's now been written into the history books in the past 30 years, is Anne Hutchinson. And if you watched the PBS series back before Christmas, they didn't say too much about Roger Williams or King Philip's War, but they did talk quite a bit on that PBS series about Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was born in England. Her father was a Puritan. He did not agree with the church. She marries a man, Mr. Hutchinson. They become followers of a preacher, a Puritan preacher in England by the name of John Cotton. When John Cotton decides 1530-something to come over here to Massachusetts Bay Colony, they and a lot of other Puritans come with him. Anne Hutchinson has lots and lots of children. She has been educated by her father. She has become a follower of this preacher. And so it is that Anne Hutchinson is quite free with her theological ideas. And because she has given birth to so many children, and childbirth is very much a woman's function, and she attends the birth of other women, she is around a lot of women, and she begins to talk about the fact that God has spoken directly to her. Now, this, you can imagine, is very sensational. And so before it's all over with, people are coming to hear her. Even men are coming to hear her. This notion that God speaks actually to her, and to be a woman on top of all of that was pretty amazing. If God can speak to her, he or she might be able to speak to me. Well, of course, now you can imagine the Puritans are not going to like this. But what has Anne Hutchinson really done? All of these hundreds and hundreds of laws, she is a very devout Puritan. She doesn't sew on Sunday. She doesn't do all these things. She doesn't play cards. She doesn't dance. She's a very devout person. So what are we going to do? Well, a trial takes place. And Anne Hutchinson is able to really stand her ground with the magistrates who try her for her activities and her interpretation of the Scripture. And what she is saying is, God can speak to me, and I'm sure that God spoke to me. I am sure. I don't have to go through all of this constant doubting, always trying to behave myself. I am sure that God picked me. So she stands up there in front of them. She goes toe to toe with the magistrates, and they don't want to deal with her. She says to them, "What law have I broken?" Huge transcript of this trial is on various websites, one of which is the PBS website. If you're interested in reading a trial transcript, this will be your ticket here. And so the judges say, "Well, what laws have you broken? You have seduced a whole lot of other people into these ideas." Now, Winthrop is accustomed at these trials to getting a confession. She flatly refuses. "I have broken no laws. I will not confess that I have done anything." And she takes a stand and refuses to confess to anything. So I think Winthrop was in quite a bit of a little dilemma here, because Winthrop realizes the consequences are going to have to come, so she is banished. She goes to Rhode Island. She will go several different places. She will actually be killed by the Indians at some point in this story. But she provided if we're looking at kind of American ideas that came from here before there was a United States, she is now sort of held up as providing this idea of God can speak to people directly. And apparently she was quite charismatic. I mean, you know, you got a choice. You got a choice of going to a church and hearing a really boring preacher, or you can go hear Anne Hutchinson interpret what the boring preacher has said. So she was a threat, and she is banished. Now, the population of New England blossoms. It thrives. The more people that are there, the more land you've got to have. Mom and pop farms, little communities, and the population expands. Well, you know who's going to have to give up land? The Indians. And there begins to be, long about 1670 or so, a realization that the Puritans are going to push us out here pretty quickly. A variety of things take place in Plymouth, this little tiny colony, almost surrounded by this great big Massachusetts Bay colony, but a king of one of the tribes is known as Massasoit, but we call him, the Puritans called him King Philip, decides that the Indians have to take a stand. It's a very long story, but again, Nathaniel Philbrick does an excellent job of talking about King Philip's War in the Mayflower book. And so for 2 years, he and his Indian supporters attack New England villages, and they almost won. They start by just random attacking of a cabin here, a community there. They kill the women and the children. They take hostages on occasion. King Philip's War is totally chaotic for New England. And finally, King Philip is captured and beheaded, and that sort of ends it. But for a good long period of time there, it was in doubt, because as much as 50% of the population was killed in these attacks, these random attacks. And King Philip was fighting for survival. So, when the war finally ends, and this had really been going on throughout the war, you have got to, if you're a good, faithful Puritan, you have got to say, what did we do to bring this punishment by God on us? King Philip's War was a punishment of us. And so you know how the Puritans will ultimately deal with this destabilization of their society. They will round up some people as witches, condemn them as witches, and will hang or kill, capital punishment, on these people who are condemned as witches. And the witchcraft trial is trials plural, is very well-known part of American history. I don't feel like I really need to say any more about this. Finally, the Puritans said enough is enough, but the Puritans lost their grasp on New England. And so what they are replaced by are these congregational churches, and the Congregational Church of New England is still very much there today, the descendant of the Puritans, but then the Baptists and lots of others are part of those progeny of the Puritans as well. That is where we're going to stop today. According to my clock, I've actually got about 5 minutes till 10:45, which is when the appointed hour for us to stop. I would be glad to entertain any questions or hear any comments that any of you might have. Do any of you have any questions or comments? Be brave. First day of class, you want to make a good impression. Yes?
You might get banished if we speak out.
You mentioned the Baptists. When did they start? I mean, did they start in Rhode Island there? I mean, where did they originate? I guess I'm trying to ask.
Well, that's a matter of opinion. The question is, when did the Baptists start? Many Baptists believe that they weren't that they are not a Protestant church, that there were Baptists back from day one, from Jesus, at least from St. Peter. They believe that there were always these little splinter groups over here and there, and the churches of Christ generally believe that too. The founder of the churches of Christ, I made this mistake in a teacher workshop down in Pulaski a few years ago, well, a long time ago now, but I made the mistake of talking about David Lipscomb as the founder of the Church of Christ, and that got me into big trouble with some of the teachers. They did not want me saying that. So you've got to make your own decision about when the churches of Christ, when the Baptist churches started. There are some Baptists who say they are not a Protestant denomination. Most everybody assumes they are, so you'll have to ask a Baptist that question. Yes, ma'am.
In my genealogy, I'm finding many of my people in this town area were labeled as Scotch-Irish, that were sort of Calvinist, but as they moved west, sort of established their own little churches.
All right, the question is, she's working on her genealogy, and lots of her ancestors appear to be Scots-Irish or Scotch-Irish. I hear the terms used interchangeably. And they were sort of Puritans, but who are the Scots-Irish? Now, they're coming next Thursday, but I will give you just a little hint of the preview. Origins were in Scotland. They didn't like authority much. If you have seen that movie Braveheart or Rob Roy, you know, the guys in the kilts fighting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of border warfare between England and Scotland. So they are sent over to Scotland, from Scotland to Ireland for a while to try to tone down those pesky Catholics that don't want to convert to the Church of England, and that doesn't work out too well, so they will eventually decide, forget it all, let's go to the colonies, and they mostly come in as indentured servants. They don't have the money, but entire congregations of these people, but they are a group of people who do not like to follow rules. Under any circumstances, they're a completely independent bunch. That's an oversimplification. But we will talk about the influence of the Scots-Irish next week.
If I'm chronologically, we're kind of getting through the 15 and 1600s.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of go on and tell us chronologically the next 4 weeks?
Oh, absolutely. I'll be glad to. Next week, we're going to do the 1700s, Hank. We're going to start with the end of the witchcraft trials and the coming of slavery into Virginia. Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War kind of go hand in hand. So that's the end of the 1600s. And then the population's going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And then we're going to have this American Revolution. And then we're going to write the Constitution. And so we're going to get the Constitution written, and then we'll go to the Enlightenment. We're going to talk about the Enlightenment and the influence of all of that on the American Revolution. And then we'll get to what is known as the Second Great Awakening, which is actually kind of the revivals over here in Kentucky, the Cane Ridge movement, and the Disciples of Christ, the Churches of Christ, the Restoration Churches. So we'll get some of that next week. And then the next week is the Civil War. That's 3. And then 4 is going to be after the Civil War, Dwight L. Moody, and then we've got to get Billy Sunday in. He's such a colorful character. And we will end with after World War II and Billy Graham and that discussion. So does that answer your question? All right, Norma's given me the high sign. Class is dismissed. Oh, let me tell you one thing before I go. I've got to go teach. I've got my real job at Vol State. I've got a class at 12:45, so I can't hang around and chit-chat today. You know, it doesn't take much to get me to talk over a grocery basket or anything else, so I'm happy to chat, but not today. I'm happy for you to email me any comments you have. Say, don't forget about so-and-so, Carol. I'm happy for you to email me, CAROLE.B as in boy, UCY at Vol State, that's VOL, V as in volunteers, volstate.edu. I'm even happy, I don't mind you calling me. The one thing I do ask you not to do, I think you'll understand why, is don't call me and leave me a message to call you back. Those of you who have done that know that I am notoriously bad about returning phone calls. So send me an email or feel free to call me at my office at home. Stop me at Kroger's, I don't care. I'm happy to talk, but just don't leave me a message for me to call you back. Thank you so much for your attention.